There's a lot to unpack here in this whole subject around Caitlyn Jenner running for governor of California. I am a Californian. I'm speaking today with thoughts as a private citizen, as a taxpayer, as a resident voter, and so that is where I'm coming from on whatever I speak of. Let me know what you think as you hear my thoughts. I will be starting with my thoughts initially before a lot really came out about the campaign, and just my initial thoughts when I heard that she had announced her run. And then I'll get into my reaction to some other people's initial reactions to this news, whether it be mainstream media, new media, people online, people in general, national and local. I want to give my reaction to some of those thoughts because it was a pretty interesting reaction, but it was something I actually sort of would expect, but I think there's a lot that people are missing, and I think maybe people are going to be eating their words very soon. So that is what is going to go on here. Let's get into my initial thoughts after the announcement was initially made, but before any news really came out about what the platform was that Caitlyn was running on. And my first initial thought was the cognitive dissonance of many in California who maybe were confused about the recall, maybe didn't know what was going on, because I'm going to touch on this in a few seconds, is the local media was really not covering it that much, and a lot of media wasn't. I don't know why. I mean, I have my suspicions, but we'll talk about that later. But it was funny because I was like, the cognitive dissonance of this story of a trans woman, Kardashian adjacent Trump Republican, from what we knew at the time, we didn't know the policy, their platform. Just, I can just hear their brains going, what the heck is going on? How do I grasp this? Because not everyone, but a lot of people, they operate on stereotypes and generalizations, which I understand why those exist, but also I think some are more on the extreme of that, of only liking or supporting something that fits in this really tight, controlled, very long list of boxes to check thing. And so when I saw this news, I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. And it's funny, when I heard this, actually, it was on the radio. I was driving down the coast, or past the coast, because I live pretty close to the coast, and we have tsunami warning kind of, I guess they're like megaphones or whatever, the warning system they use for like tornadoes with like sirens. And so we have these and so I was thinking, you know what, I can hear the cognitive dissonance so loud that it could be projected through the tsunami warning system. So that was my initial thought. Obviously not really what's happening, but anyways. So I'm going to touch on those three kind of main things that were interesting about this run for governor by Caitlyn, is the trans aspect, the Kardashian adjacent aspect, and the Trump Republican aspect. So let's get into that. So as far as the trans issues goes, I think this is going to help expose the trans activists who have been ramping up their kind of transphobic list of things that are transphobic, and widening that list as of late. And people who use the transphobic, or the labeling someone as transphobic, as basically any person who criticizes anything about a trans person, even if that criticism has nothing to do with the fact that they are trans. And so that was the first thing that really came to my head. And I know that not probably the vast majority, I mean, of activists and trans activists, people who support the trans community, probably don't use that term as a weapon in the way some do, but unfortunately there are loud voices that do that. And so to me, Caitlyn kind of is going to expose everyone who uses those labels as a means to an end for political and economic, social, whatever, power over people. And so that is a theme that I touch on pretty frequently on this channel. And so I think this is a great story that kind of melds everything personally, as far as being a Californian, me liking or not liking kind of this activism that's used as a weapon, not necessarily used for what it is intended, and the idea of liberty and freedom. So everything is kind of coming to a head here. So another thought I had was just the fact that a trans woman is running for governor and has, in my opinion, a very good shot of winning. It shows how far we've come, and I think it's important to celebrate that. I know a lot of people are dismissing the fact that Caitlyn is trans to support their political agenda or to kind of bash her in other ways, whether she's a Republican or her policies or whatever, which are all fair, but they're also not accepting the fact that her being a trans woman running for governor of the most populous state in the country, in the most prosperous country in the world, is a win. And so, and it brought me back to at first when Bruce transitioned into Caitlyn. It was, I think for a lot of people, maybe not as much for me for my age, but a lot of older people who maybe are a little more conservative, were new to the whole idea of trans and all those things. It was a little more difficult for people to grasp what was really happening. And I think personally they did a really good job from a meeting and from a marketing standpoint, of getting the story out there, using it as an education tool for what they could at the time, really giving Caitlyn the attention and the light that is needed to create a situation where trans people are looked at as humans and as just more humans that are just maybe a little bit different, or they're not exactly like everyone else, but they should be treated equally and they should be respected, and they should be we should want to learn about them and know more about them, if that makes sense. And so I just think about where we've come from then. I don't even think twice about calling Caitlyn or calling her, because it's become so normal, and we've lived with her for, gosh, what has it been, like 5, 6, 7 years now, I think. And so I think that is something I think is really cool, is that she is at this point where she is running for office, and the biggest backlash against her is basically anything but the fact that she's trans, from what I've seen. And of course, like I'm saying, the people who are kind of using the trans thing as a weapon maybe are in the minority in most cases, but are not as loud as I think maybe it would have been decades ago or a few years ago even. So that is how I think. And I will say about that too is, in my real life, when I've known people who were trans, it is a lot harder for me, or it was a lot harder for me to myself transition into calling her they or them, and then him or her, or sometimes it was actually easier to call them by their name after transitioning, which was very interesting to me as I was going through it, because instead of me feeling like I was going to slip up misgendering them, I would just use their real name, like their what was it, what's the term for, not your pronoun, but your proper name, if that makes sense. So I think that was very interesting. And so that to me, it was a little harder, I guess, with someone in person that I know through that transition. But I guess over time, it just becomes more natural. And I would think most trans people give people grace at the beginning. So there's that. You can touch on that a little more if you want. But and then as far as the trans community goes, I wrote down that I thought it was good for the trans community, because this is giving visibility and giving the impression that a trans person can basically, I don't want to say do anything, which they should be able to do everything. What Caitlyn is showing is that being trans doesn't stop you from pursuing whatever you want to pursue. Makes sense. And I think this is in that same quote unquote playbook that was used, that a lot of people actually celebrate as far as and admire, or I should say praise the effort used when leading up to the legalization of same-sex marriage or homosexual marriage, whatever the term is now, where there was a deliberate marketing effort to show that gay people are just like everyone else. They just happen to love someone of the same sex. And so to me, this Caitlyn running for governor and being taken seriously and not being dismissed just because she's trans is along those same lines. And I think it will help destigmatize the trans world. And so that's what I think. Okay. One more thing before we get into the card about the trans topic of this is I know there was confusion when Bruce transitioned to Caitlyn, and there were reports that Caitlyn still had some of the same, or held the same views she had when she was Bruce. And although we can go back and forth on what those policies are, which in future topics we will, or future videos of this, we will most definitely do a lot of that stuff. This is kind of a prelude, preface, first kind of general thoughts of me because I have so much to talk about. But I think the fact that Caitlyn holds the same policy positions and values as Bruce did is what makes Caitlyn so important to the trans community. And it's that she is truly herself now. Internally, she had these policy positions, she had these values, but internally she felt she was a woman. And now the outside and the name and everything, the perception by the world matches that. And so to me, it is concerning that there are people who think that when Caitlyn, or when Bruce transitioned to Caitlyn, that she all of a sudden had to change all these beliefs and policies that she held. And so I think that is a dangerous mindset, to think that all trans people have to think and act and look the same, and that anyone who doesn't is claimed as, or is not claimed by, or is looked at as a joke, or is told that they make the community look bad. And so I think embracing all trans people across all spectrums of culture, of politics, of social, of anything, workplace, whatever you want to call it, is how we get to a place of seeing trans people as fellow humans, which I think will lead to them being less disproportionately affected by certain issues. So I want to talk about the Kardashian adjacent aspect of this. And when I saw this, and I have thoughts on the family not being, or the Kardashian side and the Jenner side not being supportive of Caitlyn's run for governor. And I think I'm going to table those thoughts for another time because there's a whole other thing to that. And I'm sure more will come out about that. Hold on, let me take a sip. And okay, the reason why I think the Kardashian adjacent thing, regardless of if they support Caitlyn or not, is interesting is because just Caitlyn being around the Kardashians, whether she was Bruce or when she was Bruce or now that she's Caitlyn, the marketing machine that we all know the Kardashians are, whether we like them or not, is an advantage for Caitlyn. And the relationships she has with the media, and she said in her interview that I'm going to talk about pretty soon, she's been around politics for a time and she's been involved. And so she has a lot of things on her side that also are working against her, which I'll touch on again about kind of the elite privilege side of things. But the visibility that she already had before she transitioned, and of course as she was transitioning and after, that is a huge plus. And one thing that also really set my mind on a track of she has a very, very strong possibility of winning, or at least has a really good chance, is recent steps she has taken to what I see as modernizing her business. What I mean by that is she's had a YouTube channel that I've watched a few videos on that, and I was like, this is actually pretty interesting, because what's interesting is because we've known Bruce through the Kardashians and we knew what his hobbies were, and now we see Caitlyn on her YouTube channel with pretty much the same hobbies. I mean, Caitlyn still likes cars. She still likes model helicopters, still likes golfing, still likes a lot of things that we knew Bruce as. And that goes back to my earlier point about Caitlyn internally still being liking and holding the same values and whatnot. So the YouTube channel is a very modern way to get that message out, and I think is very smart. Whether that was her decision or her marketing team or publicity team or whatever, I don't know, but it was smart. Also, I saw a recent video of a YouTube video of Caitlyn hanging out with a TikToker who has a YouTube channel now, Noah Beck, and them doing a video like a car chat kind of thing, which I thought was interesting as well. And he is one of the biggest current new media stars. And so it just thought to me like, okay, the savvy of the marketing and all of that is right on point and is a very big advantage compared to other candidates that are in the race right now, which I'll touch on those, I think, at some point too, but because I'm going to continue following this recall election because I'm very much in it as far as where I'm from and what I do and kind of what I've been following. But anyways, the other one is John Cox, who actually ran against Governor Gavin Newsom in 2018. And former San Diego mayor, and his name is drawing a blank in my head right now, but a former San Diego mayor, he's running as well. But they don't have the visibility and the reach and the notoriety of Caitlyn. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens debate-wise too. The Trump Republican aspect, which I'm going to get into more of that when I react to other people's reactions in a few seconds. But my initial thought was, because this is a recall election, to recall Gavin Newsom, who is a Democrat, Kamala Harris adjacent, Nancy Pelosi, former nephew by marriage, and a recall election that, from what I've seen, from what I know in my real life, a lot of the people who are supportive of the recall, there was a wide range of people who are supportive. It's not just this, as Gavin Newsom said in one of his interviews once the recall became apparent and he went on a publicity tour to kind of hopefully soften the blow. He basically said, which I know what he was doing, and I don't think he really meant it, but he tried to paint everyone who was supportive of the recall as these QAnon extremists and the people who are in charge of the recall as these extremist QAnon people. And unfortunately, what Gavin Newsom did when he did that is, one, he used the playbook of trying to discredit the whole movement. But people like myself, who know a lot of people who are supportive of the recall, from what I've seen from the people I know who are supportive, it is a wide range of Republican, Democrat, people who like politics and follow it a lot, people who don't, some people who don't really care that much, but they know that the policies, especially over this past year in response to the pandemic, have really negatively affected everyone in the state, regardless of what your political affiliation or your policy positions are. And I mean, I guess maybe not policy position, because if you supported his policy positions of what has affected other people, you maybe aren't as invested. But if you have a small business, if you like your liberties and your freedom, or if you have any financial situation that was pretty much swept out from under you as a result of some things, and the fact that when we did push back and we did say, okay, we're not doing this, or we protested or whatever, he doubled down and didn't listen, that is kind of what this recall is about. And so what I thought was, when Caitlyn announced her candidacy or her campaign, I thought to myself, if she takes on a Trump-esque, granted, she's come out and said, especially on the trans issues, she is not fully supportive of what President Trump has done. But if you adopt many of those policies, which would, in most cases, go over well with people who are supportive of the recall, then she has a good chance to win. That was my initial thought when I first heard her announce, because I knew she was kind of a Trump person, but not sure exactly how much of a Trump person she was, because only a few things had come out. But that was my initial thought, was, if we're going to have a recall against Gavin Newsom, And if the recall is really about the policy, not necessarily Gavin himself, then a Trump-esque person, policy-wise, would be a good match for people to support. And Caitlyn, like I said, with the notoriety and all the marketing and everything going on, that she is kind of that right now, I think is one of the top candidates and has the best chance, in my opinion. But if it's really just about Gavin and people just not liking him, not necessarily his policies, which I have a hard time believing that would just the person's personality would drive the whole recall. But then again, we had two impeachments of President Trump that some would say were based on just not liking him as a person or and whatnot. So I don't know. It could be a mix and it could be mixed, like I said. But anyways, okay. So other reactions that I saw after the announcement from media at first on both a national and a local level. So there was media pointing out. So initially, there wasn't a lot of support for her campaign in a traditional sense, meaning like media jumping on it and supporting her from a mainstream perspective, and put politicians and I don't know, political groups and and organizations coming out in support of Caitlyn's campaign. But in my opinion, the media pointing out their lack of support for this or their disdain for this campaign is a good thing, in my opinion, because it indicates that she is actually a true outsider. Because like in a non-politician type that I personally like at this point, because in my opinion, the reason we are in such a bad place is the political career establishment that are basically using us for their own personal gain. And so I see Caitlyn as a Donald Trump-like figure in terms of the media not necessarily liking them and people not necessarily coming out of the woodworks in the political field, in the political world, to grab on support her. So that was an interesting thing. I thought they think they know what they're doing, but I think really it's indicating to some who, especially now that we know what the media is really doing, what's really going on. So local media who have been relatively silent from what I've seen about the whole recall movement in general, this recent one, have been relatively silent on the matter until now, until it looked like it was, or pretty much for sure going to happen. And so it kind of, once they started covering it, I have a feeling some people who didn't know about it or maybe didn't take it so seriously are now maybe a little bit confused that it's actually happening. And I know this wasn't the first effort for a recall for Gavin Newsom. And so I think just the continuing tries trying to get him recalled, coupled with his very extreme reaction to the pandemic, has really just brought everyone together enough to support the recall. So now I want to get into the recent interview that Caitlyn did with Sean Hannity from the Fox channel, which was last week, about the recall and her campaign. And the one thing that I want to touch on about this, which I can do a whole breakdown probably, and I'm sure she'll do a ton of more interviews, but she mentioned a few times that they were doing the interview in her airport hangar and how they're talking about her house and the wildfires and having a perimeter around it, and kind of touching on a few things that obviously make her a little more privileged than the rest. And I think when Doreen comes back, she was in the comments talking about the access to resources that Caitlyn has over other trans people. I think this kind of goes into that conversation. But people were pointing out the privilege Caitlyn has, that she pointed out in that interview, and we're using that as the headline coming out of that interview instead of focusing on the policies that she supports. And I think there's two things here. There's two types of elite people. There's elites who have made it themselves and support policies that are not elitist. And then there's elites who act as elitists and support policies that are kind of elitist, in my opinion, or that keep people who aren't elite from getting elite or from moving up or doing better in their lives. And so that to me, I think is the key difference here is while yes, Caitlyn has privilege and has access to things that most people don't, the fact that she's supporting policies that, in my opinion, are going to remove barriers for people to build a better life for themselves and have more and be more and maybe move from the lower class where they feel a little more stressed financially or because of their access or whatever it is, to get to a more comfortable place for them, which to them may feel elite and powerful. So that was one thing I thought that was interesting, that they're trying to frame her as an elite, which this conversation I'm sure will come up again very soon and we'll have more in-depth discussion. While I see that and I understand that, I don't think it should be something to completely dismiss her from being able to do something. So there's that. Let me see what else. And also I had another note here saying this made me think at the time when those headlines were coming out that if someone has created a life of privilege for themselves, why isn't it that people, instead of discrediting them because of their now privilege, why don't we figure out what they did to get there? And if they are supporting positions like I think Caitlyn is, that will help others at least be on the path. Maybe this generation won't get there, but it's setting up the future generations to have a little more comfortable of a life. Why don't we embrace those people and understand what their mindset was, what they think, what they do every day, what train of thought they have, what processes they implement in their life, how they treat people to get to the point where they're that successful. That's what I think we could shift the conversation from privilege being bad to how did these people get this privilege? Of course, some people get privilege in very nefarious, bad ways, but for the ones that don't, let's try to understand them and say, hey, how can I implement these things in my life? So there's that. All right, let's check the chat again, make sure everyone's good. Okay, everyone's good. Good. All right. So now online comments. So I've seen people from different, whether it's like independent media people or just people commenting online in general, comment sections of people having to, or seemingly feeling the need to preface their dislike for Caitlyn as saying, well, I'm gay, but, or I'm trans, but, or I'm a woman, but, before saying I don't like Caitlyn. And I think this is a problem or something that has been created by the whole identity politics trend that we've seen. And I personally don't think you have to preface it by saying I'm trans woman or I'm gay before you say you don't like Caitlyn, because I think you can not like Caitlyn and still be like a supportive of trans rights or women's rights or gay rights, whatever it is. And so I think it's interesting that that was a very common thing. I was like, whoa, is it really that? I don't know. It just seems very weird. And I think it goes back to that whole thing that happened during the Amy Coney Barrett Supreme Court Justice confirmation hearings, where the big conversation around healthcare was severability and keeping, like in that case, keeping Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act intact, but removing the parts that are unconstitutional. If that was the idea behind severability, just because one part of it is bad or unconstitutional or unlawful doesn't mean the whole thing has to be thrown out. And so I think that's something that can be applied to this situation. And it also reminded me of the backlash to women who did not vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016, which was people said, how could you not vote for the woman as a woman? And I think it goes back to this, which is it wasn't that she was didn't vote for her because she was a woman or because they thought women shouldn't be in that position. They didn't vote for Hillary because she wasn't the woman that they think was qualified or wasn't the person they think was qualified, if that makes sense. People weren't saying, I didn't vote for Hillary because she's a woman. People said, I didn't vote for Hillary because she's, I'm saying this wrong. They said, I don't want that woman in, if that makes sense. I hope that came out. I didn't have that written out, so that didn't come out as well as I thought, but I think you know what I mean. It wasn't that people only didn't vote for Hillary because she was a woman. It's because of the other things. Hopefully that makes sense. Also, I've seen some reacting to this online because obviously this made national news and national attention. And whether you like it or not, what happens in California is a precursor to what is coming to your doorstep wherever you are in America at some point, sometime soon. Whether you like it or not, that could be a whole nother discussion on another day too. But and I saw people in other states saying and putting polls up on their social media and whatnot saying, if you were in California, would you vote for Caitlyn? And while I understand and I think it's important that people nationally and around the world focus on this race because California has a very high concentration of a lot of things that control the country and the world, whether it's technology, whether it's infrastructure or farming or agriculture for the rest of the country, whether it's, like I said, technology or information or ports. It's all a big part of a lot of what happens in our everyday life. And so it's important to, I think, just keep a little bit of an eye on what's going on here. And it is a precursor for what will happen in your neighborhood very soon, like I said. But although everyone should be interested, in my opinion, and follow this and say maybe what they would do if they were a Californian or not, at the end of the day, California voters have the power in this election. And so there's that. A lot of what has come out as a result of Caitlyn announcing her run for governor of California in the recall election against Gavin Newsom is that this kind of reassured me and confirmed that I was on the right track of thinking a few months ago when I announced on this channel that I was no longer putting the label of Republican onto myself as far as what I am politically. And so a few examples here that I saw recently was a lot of conversation around, quote unquote, all Republicans are this, or Trump transphobic this, or whatever, because Caitlyn is a Trump supporter, but she's actually come out and debunked that by saying, I don't agree with a lot of his trans positions. Or another one, which is Caitlyn the murderer, which is in reference to the car accident that she was a part of a few years ago, right when she was transitioning, where a lot of people think that she got away with murder or manslaughter, whatever the charges were. So people are using that against her now. And a lot of these are the reasons why I no longer put the label of Republican or any political party on myself, is because then I have to justify or go into this whole list of exceptions that come with when someone labels themselves the way you do. You have to kind of separate yourself in a way, which is kind of why I stay away from, or I criticize a lot of the activism type stuff, which might be something that will be interesting to hear between me and Doreen from the Tennessee Bald Mom at some point. We'll go along with that. But like I said, when you put everyone in this box of quote unquote, like let's say Republican, and then you have these list of exceptions for these Republicans you don't like, or some of the policies that the Republican majority likes, but you don't. And so I personally just want to remove that label because it's one of the easy things I can remove for myself. It doesn't take like this huge life-altering event for that to happen, really. Take each person, each candidate, like Caitlyn, although she is a Republican, that to me doesn't mean anything at this point, and evaluate each thing about them, policies, whatever, character, however I want to evaluate them. And so that was one thing that reassured me about my label removal. There's a truck going by. And the other one was that people saying Caitlyn's policy is the reason they think she won't get elected, because I think of the perceived perception of what California politics are currently matched with, and kind of the narrative around California and the West Coast of, oh, let's just drop them in the Pacific Ocean. We can just forget them all. Forgetting the fact that we have the most populous state, California, with the most registered Republicans, even though, like I just said, I don't like that label, but it is an indication that it isn't so like one-sided, really. There's a lot of reasons for that, but so the people who are saying that Caitlyn won't get elected for her policies or for certain reasons are actually the reasons I think she can, and potentially and likely, in my opinion, at this point, will be elected. Because the reason, like I said before, that the recall is happening is because of the policies, for my observation, of Gavin Newsom. And if Caitlin's policy positions are enough different or enough opposite of that, and or are more attractive to the majority of voters, regardless of party affiliation, who are going to show up to the recall election, then she's in. And everyone doubting her will have, I think, a similar reaction to what happened in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in that election, and that whole thing that led to, for people who learn from that, a wake-up call that there is a ton of people out there who think differently than you, and that political party labels are only a means to an end at some point when you are confronted with the disconnect between the group you identify with and what you support and stand for. Now, this election is probably, from what I've been hearing, isn't going to happen until the fall. So we have several months to really keep covering this and hear developments, see who else jumps in the race. Because as you know, or maybe you don't know, in 2003, that was the last recall for Gray Davis, which ended up going through, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, actor, bodybuilder, was the one that replaced him. And so from what I remember, I was 7 years old when that happened, and I vaguely remember afterwards and kind of learning about it, and especially when this recall really gains traction, I really went back and kind of tried to refresh my memory or learn a little more what happened then. And what I do recall from what I've learned from that is a lot of interesting characters jumped in, whether it be porn stars, actors, former child stars, kind of normal people, a whole wide range of people jumped in. And so I'm thinking, unless the candidates now like Caitlin, John Cox, and the former mayor of San Diego, unless those are really supported, prominent people who maybe people think have a good shot and are really backing, I don't know, maybe this time there won't be as many people jumping in. And maybe a lot of people who would have jumped in maybe have already moved out of the state, because we know that's a whole other thing too. So those are my thoughts.